Hello, everyone. We're gathering here in the virtual social hour, I should say, but we're getting our red wine. So we'll be with you shortly.
Don't let him fool you. It's usually Prosecco for me.
Yeah, there's
Let me say
priorities.
hello to a few people. I see some of my friends in California. Peter Anderson, who's actually on the board of Kitalys. This is when we really get to know each other. And he's going to be speaking tomorrow, right, Peter, on the behavior.
Looking forward to it.
One of the interesting things has been this confluence today of hard science and the way we really live. And Peter is pretty good. Peter, say a couple of words about your life actually in the hospitality industry and how you've seen this trend toward wellness and away from just coming there for leisure, but going to hotels and resorts and going to travel for the purposes of staying healthier and changing habits.
Well, it's interesting. About 20 years ago, when I started in hotel spas, it was all about pampering, hair and nails, massages. The whole industry has changed. We're the light version of the science we talked about today. And people are putting a lot of money into enhancing their lifestyle without really understanding or knowing the science behind it. So we come to this at a completely opposite perspective, but the trends are fairly significant. The industry is just booming, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it's kind of interesting to view this from a science lens as opposed to a leisure lens. I mean, we are going to be meeting in the middle.
A votre santé tous. We've had a great day, and thank you, Peter, for getting us started. Thank you all for contributing, either by listening actively or indeed participating effectively. I've loved every session, and I hope that you have as well.
Can we encourage everyone to turn on your cameras? We see about, I don't know, 7 or 8 of you, but there are various other people in the room. Thank you, David, for your Ludwig pool. Hey,
Yeah,
pool.
that was great, David. Thank you very much.
Is that Ken?
And Ken Ford, I really want you, Ken, to be on our program next year. You are the guru in healthy metabolism. You make a distinction between getting into disease, treating the disease, and more human performance. And you are yet another expert that we've got to sign up. Ken is director of the Institute of Human Cognition and Machine. Well, say it for me, Ken. I always mess it up. You're muted, but
Institute for Human and Machine Cognition.
There you go. Okay. Well, it's an amazing institution. It's actually in my hometown of Pensacola, Florida, but it's the recipient of one of the largest totals of government support for the work they're doing and the strategic research areas. And Ken is quite a remarkable figure in the world he lives in.
All right, stop it.
Okay. Well, you have to promise. I'll stop if you'll agree to speak next year.
By the way, I see some folks who are active in the chat. Maybe not all of your questions or comments could have been addressed. This is a good time to pursue them if you'd like. Gary Scott, Vivian Lowe, I saw you guys active in that most recent nutrition panel. So I welcome you guys. And again, anybody else who's here, but we can't see your faces, because please turn on your cameras.
Yeah.
Vivian and Scott, your cameras are off, but if you can ask your questions one way or the other, we'd be happy to hear them.
Or comment. We'll take
Sure.
profuse compliments and utterly devastating rebuttals of anything you heard today.
And good to see Paul Strange, my old friend, or friend of many years.
Very long time, yes.
And I just want to say that Vivian will also be a speaker too, so we're going to be hearing from her too.
Yeah, Vivian is another young rising star.
Claude, good to see you again, Ladinois. Noise. I don't know how you pronounce it here in the States, but
You said it beautifully. Maybe I'll make a comment. One area I think we've totally missed the mark, and that is, and while we're sipping our wine, I might disappoint some people, and that is we failed to look at Apoe genotyping in nutritional recommendations, and the Apoe genotype really dictates what percentage of should be carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and 25% of the population has a copy of E4. 1 in 4 people have a copy of E4. If you have a copy of E4, sad to say, my recommendation to my patients is they get one adult beverage a week, because alcohol makes lipids worse, and there's some data that say it increases breast cancer in women. So this whole thing about a little wine or beer, every day for everybody is okay. There is a significant portion of people where that is not actually beneficial at all.
Vivian informed me to my regret in the chat that there's no minimum safe amount of alcohol, apparently, like tobacco. And as you say, it very much depends on the genotype of the folks. So you have to pay attention to the segments.
Yes, I'm actually pleased that I got a letter from Boston Heart, who does Apoe genotyping, and they said they joined with some diet ID group. And so the first thing I wrote to the ID group was, you're probably not doing it, but please tell me you are doing it. You're actually basing your nutritional recommendations on Apoe genotype. And she said, yes. So if that's truly true, then that's the first organization I know that really is focusing on proper nutrition for everybody. And I think that's something that's very, very important, and it's not been addressed.
Gordon,
Yeah, Gordon, you had a comment.
Well, I'm very interested, Claude, to hear that, and to the point that Vivian made about a year ago, I, with great difficulty, I wouldn't say great difficulty, but with some sadness, I decided to give up alcohol, really based on the brain size changes and the atrial fibrillation risk that is evident even at half a drink a day. But I do have an ApoE4, and I was unfamiliar. I am familiar with data suggesting that many of the adverse metabolic effects of aging, the rise in LDL, the rise in fasting blood sugar, and so forth, are more rapid in the ApoE4 group. The trajectory with age is adverse. And so, but I wasn't aware of anyone who's put forth ApoE4 carrier recommendations. So very interesting.
Yeah, and if you know Bob Eckel got the award at the Heart and the Heart and Diabetes conference in New York. And in that paper, he actually shows some really fascinating data on lipoprotein lipase activity in the brain and how it's affected by ApoE4.
Very interesting. Not familiar with that.
Good stuff.
I just saw Gary Scott actually put something in chat, apologizing for not having a camera, but I think he did want to say something. So we'll give him a second if that's possible.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Gary.
Unmute.
You're muted. Just unmute yourself, Gary, if you can, if you've got a comment, please.
Well, we'll come back to you, Gary, in a moment. I see another Bostonian, our dear friend, Mustafa. I lost your picture. Where are you?
I'm here and really enjoying the conference. It's been really amazing with the distinguished group of people and really thought-provoking and informative discussions that, always you want to go away from these meetings with more questions in mind, stimulated and, kind of thinking like, oh, well, that is an interesting idea that I take back. So just this first day has been truly remarkable in that. Not to mention your incredible historical entry. I knew it was a very interesting location, but all of that history was quite quite a nice break. You did a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, Zan, I think I missed your call, and you just make the excellent tour guide. It's just
Oh,
amazing.
no. I am going to keep my day job, but I do like showing Harper's Ferry off, and I welcome all of you to come visit. Particularly if you're from out of town, I'll give you the royal treatment. If you're a neighbor, not so much.
No, and we had to give instructions to the panelists. I asked a lot of them to come on early, and I knew that some of them would be coming in under the break. And they would say, this can't be the right place. We have to be on the Travel Channel, because they would be seeing Zan doing his terrific tourism job. So I said, you know what? You will see something about Harper's Ferry, because I didn't want them to leave. But it was beautiful.
It's impressive that some of you chose to waive the break for biological breaks or what have you to actually listen. Vivian, I am interested to hear you come online. I saw in the chat that you were reminding me that alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen, but I don't know if you want to turn on your mic and camera and introduce yourself to the cocktail party, or the social hour, I should say.
Yeah, Vivian is quite a talented person outside the realm of science and medicine as well, a novelist and an accomplished dancer. We've even been entertaining the idea of a talent show.
Yes.
Of folks in our world, and we're learning more and more about you and how
we'll
much
take applications all month long.
Ken Ford used to play a mean guitar in a rock band.
I've specially choreographed a piece for you.
Oh my gosh! Well,
I think next year, you'll do a solo.
We'll get Yo-Yo Ma to play the company.
I'm just trying to finish up my meal. I'll turn on my camera soon, but I'm in between patients.
Okay.
So, but wonderful conference. I really enjoyed it, and I was hopping in and out as much as I could.
Well,
Vivian, I know, I think I saw somewhere you had some dance or choreography or dance performance with Radcliffe. I was a member of the Harvard Radcliffe Dance Company, so we'll have to get together over a drink of something that's not too much of a carcinogen and talk about.
Just plain H2O. But I actually did choreograph for an opera. It was a Stravinsky piece for Lowell House Opera at Harvard, and that was probably one of my favorite commissions. Really enjoyed that. So, and I know the Radcliffe has a very good dance program. So
I know that was well after my time. I'm sorry I missed it.
Wow, amazing. Well, indeed, music and the performing arts are another way to approach healthy longevity. So we'd love to be able to emphasize that as well.
We're going to be talking a little bit more about the culture of longevity tomorrow. And that includes lifelong learning, life engagement. We're having a wonderful talk. You may have seen it on the schedule with Ken Dykewald about what the current situation is right now in terms of our own healthcare and healthy longevity, all the way up to the potential for living to 120 plus. But one of the questions we're actually asking at this conference is, why age? What will you do with your time? And so some of that input is also very important. The purpose-driven life is pretty easy for most of the people on this particular conference, but not for everybody. So we really are trying to break silos around here and talk about not only the value of health, but the value of the years that health can give us.
Well said.
By the way, I have auditioned for many, many, many plays and dances, and I always heard the same word, next. That's the truth.
Hazel Zeto, good to see you back. Wonderful discussion early today.
His metabolism, that was great.
Yeah, hi, Zan. That was really an extraordinary, gathering of ideas.
It was just amazing. And, it's interesting that you saw an example of somewhat two different universes, or worlds. The panel you were in, then the panel that the longevity experts,
Geroscience,
the
years,
geroscience,
Yes.
yeah,
Mhm.
these two communities don't interact that much. We have some crossover, but it does show that there is still some silos remaining to be broken down. But you do hit across both worlds, and you're a great teacher as well as a great developer. I'm very excited about your drug that's up for FDA review.
just a
It's-
notion. So go
Yeah,
ahead.
it's
Go ahead.
sitting there, and
Well,
that has been so much of
We
a
can help you.
challenge. You know, when you talk about the FDA is very supportive of orphan diseases, but wow, when you try to develop a drug for an ultra rare orphan disease, it becomes really hard because they want patient numbers that there just aren't any out there.
Mhm.
yeah, well, blessings on you.
And for the people in the room here, Hazel is going to be back on a panel on targeting mitochondria with a panel that's moderated by Doug Wallace of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. That's on day 3, Wednesday. I think it's morning. So I urge those who can make it, who are interested, to please join us for that.
That should be a good one. I mean, there will be more of the science there, but this morning's meeting was really good because it really brought out just the big ideas.
Yes, indeed.
Hazel Gordon Cutler, as an expert on mitochondria, I'm curious whether you feel that any of the things that have been tried in animals that are presumably relatively safe, whether it's alpha ketoglutarate or beta hydroxybutyrate or the MitoPure supplement that apparently is commercially available now. Do you think any of those, from your assessment of the evidence, merit somebody thinking about taking them? Or do you think it's all too early yet?
Well, I think when you are talking about the natural metabolites, like when you're talking about alpha ketoglutarate, for instance, I'm actually a firm believer of some of those that should be used as supplements, and it depends on the status of the person. But I'm actually starting manufacturing on a new supplement that is to boost mitochondrial energy for both enhancing physical and emotional resilience. I think something that fits into this post-COVID or during COVID anxiety that people are living in. So a lot of those supplements can work, provided you have not individual ones, but you really design them with all the right cofactors at the same time.
Yeah.
Hazel, what is your compound and mechanism? Can you say?
Well, the compound that has been in clinical trials quite a bit is elamipretide, or it was known in like over 200 papers. It's SS31.
Right.
And it's just a small peptide. It's a tetrapeptide that when I first discovered it, it targeted to mitochondria, to the inner membrane. But then, another 15 years of work, I figured out it was targeting to cardiolipin.
Mhm.
And that now I have learned to appreciate as just a phenomenal target because it's so important for so many things.
Yeah, well, it's a great story. And David Ludwig, wow, what a great session you had with Michael Zimmel and others. I loved your presentation. You did not get in too much to ketogenesis. That's a hot topic. Any thoughts about the role of ketogenesis and, well, intermittent fasting you did touch on, but how about induced ketogenesis with compounds that actually
Mimics.
ketogenic mimics?
Sure. Well,
Mimetics.
thanks for the kind comments. I think this carbohydrate insulin model is an alternative to the conventional way of thinking. Says, we've had causality backward. It's not overeating that's driving fat storage over the long term. We know that, yes, if you force feed animals or humans acutely, they'll gain weight. But consistently in these protocols, you stop the force feeding and weight comes back down to where it started. So you can push calories into fat cells, but they don't stay put. They come out. So the question is, what's triggering fat cells to hold on to those calories? Yeah. And we think that the conventional way of thinking does not answer that question, nor does it give a good explanation for why body weight set point is climbing up. So the alternative way of thinking is that energy balance is downstream. Kind of like when you get a fever, you have to have a positive energy balance, but the upstream effect, the cause is interleukins and changes in your brain that make you want to be warmer. And then the blood vessel constriction, the shivering to generate a positive is downstream. So we got to focus upstream. So coming back to obesity, but key drivers are insulin to glucagon ratio, not the only drivers, but those are key drivers that are, the advantage of those are they're immediately modifiable. We know that states of high insulin will cause fat cells to take up calories and restrain lipolysis. And glucagon has the opposite effects. So by lowering carbohydrate down to 20% or so, we can shift insulin to glucagon a lot. Now, to answer your question, we can go further. When you get down below about 10%, then you get into the ketogenic range. So there's no longer enough glucose to run the brain. Insulin levels drop to a level that free fatty acids lipolysis is very high. It drives ketogenesis in the liver. And then over a few days to weeks, the brain shifts much, not all, but most of its metabolism to ketones, which are a very efficient fuel. They also have anti-aging potential we didn't talk about, but that's the very exciting line of research, anti-aging, anti-cancer, and such. And so those ketones then may operate through a whole new set of mechanisms. And then lastly, in terms of intermittent fasting, they're synergistic with this. Don't try, my advice to patients is don't try intermittent fasting if you're on a conventional high-fat diet. I mean, look around. People can't even go from lunch to dinner without snacking because you have to fat adapt first. You have to lower your insulin and allow your fat cells to adapt to fat and release fat efficiently. Once you've done that, so, and that's simply just cutting out the processed carbs, increasing healthy fats. Once you fat adapt, then fasting becomes easy. I could never fast. On Yom Kippur, I'd look forward to it with dread for and then, I could make it to noon and then, I'd white knuckle it and I'd just be watching the sun, I really suffered. But this last one, where I'm now really nicely fat adapted, and also strong coffee helps because it's lipolytic. You may or may not want to have that on Yom Kippur, but it makes fasting much easier. And then you get new levels of synergy. And so I do intermittent fasting. I do time restricted eating. So I have strong coffee in the morning. I have no hunger till 12 or 1. I eat a low carb meal. And then at dinner, I eat whatever I want, including carbohydrates.
Fascinating.
David, I don't remember, maybe you said this or someone else, but don't blame the butter for what the bread may be responsible for. I love that.
It's very good. Excellent.
Everybody knows my story. If you read the Connexum newsletter, you'll see a little bit of an autobiography, but I was what was called a cardiac cripple till I was 48 years old. And now speaking of Harper's Ferry, I can walk 50 miles around the Potomac in one day with my group. And I do all those things. I'm like a little petri dish for first responders.
What did you change?
Well, I changed twice. One at 48 because I had a late life child and I couldn't run it over after a toddler. And I did that with a speaker who is coming on tomorrow, an adult fitness coach that changed my life at the beginning and explained to me how to exercise and eat right. And then 25 years later, which is now, with a Russian fitness expert who explained to me how I can continue to travel all my life and not bring weights with me and still being able to affect my mitochondria. So I'm one of these first responders. But I have to tell you that what I have done has been on faith. And that's important as a consumer, because I'm not a scientist. I have done what sounded right. But when I go through this incredible conference that we're having, I begin to understand why I'm doing it.
Adrian, I hope I don't get it wrong, but did you tell me at one point you considered yourself obese? Or, I mean, your
I
transformation
wasn't
was
considered obese. I was. And even as
Amazing.
a child, look, I was one of the first
it was a true transformation.
9-year-old guinea pigs doing beta blockers and all kinds of metabolic changes as a very small child, because I was very obese and my dad had died when I was a kid from obesity. So it's quite a transformation, but it requires a lot of motivation. Which we're going
Well,
to talk
this is
about
what
tomorrow.
Vivian Lowe does. That's why she's, well, she's now on. She's been seeing patients on and off all day. And this is her daily practice to help people first by characterizing their metabolic state and then to do something about it.
But she also says this is a carcinogen.
Well, yeah, there's some things that we have trouble with, but Vivian will work around that.
Just as a comment, I wasn't really familiar with SS31. I know what the formula is now, but so I just Googled it. If you Google it, all you get is first one I get is the mitochondrial support optimizer, the mitochondrial formula, and it's only $95 for a bottle.
Oh,
So,
wow.
So, geez, you can make a lot of money really fast.
You could take it with True Niagen, because that's only $60 a bottle.
Yeah. Well, this is the problem.
Sorry, just to jump in, because, right after what David was saying, and I certainly admire your work, David, and I think we communicated briefly via email. But my job is to translate as much as the science to my patient population, right? Because as a clinician, I have to make sure that this works for my patients. And I think that last section was Dr. Flack, who was talking about how we can have all these different pieces of knowledge, but how do you integrate it and how do you bring it to the patient and make it applicable, make it something that they can do, right, in their lives. So we're not just having disparate pieces of information. And I think that's where the biggest challenge is. If we go to what David said, I know that there's a lot of interest, let's say, in intermittent fasting. But, my thoughts on that is, while I think it helps increase your insulin sensitivity, one challenge is if people are doing this as a lifestyle. If you're looking at my patient population, we have people with sarcopenia, and particularly sarcopenic obesity, which is even more challenging. Maybe they have diabetes, which is actually devastating to muscle as well, right? And so now I have this challenge of getting in protein within a very short feeding period. And most people, by the way, who do intermittent fasting, I found, start their first meal at noon or after that, which is already off your circadian clock. So that's another component now you have to think about. Okay, circadian rhythm, how much do you dose the protein, right? And so you take these disparate pieces of information, and in themselves they're good science, but now how do you translate it for someone who has to get up, maybe has 2 jobs, 3 kids, and limited resources? How do you make that work? Because in the end, if we cannot translate it to that patient's life, then it's just sitting there. That information is just sitting there. So I think for me, that's the challenge, is to take this wonderful science and make it applicable in my population of patients with anabolic resistance. After age 30, it's really hard to build that muscle mass back. So having a very short feeding period, for example, makes it quite challenging.
Well, Vivian, besides your focus on simply obesity, I guess you could say, you have a real interest in sarcopenia, which I believe is equally important. It's a condition that is afflicting us as a nation, and it's only getting worse as a condition that leads to frailty and a host of chronic diseases that only get worse as one becomes more frail. Gordon, you spoke about this yourself, sarcopenia being a very important target and one that we just haven't made progress against, but at least we can start by recognizing it. And that's one thing you do in your practice, Vivian. And so what we need are approaches that will actually address directly sarcopenia.
Just a question, would like resistance training for the masses move the needle?
Yeah,
Well,
this
sure.
is important, but then you have a debilitated population, and then you have to get a little bit more creative. And I do use isometrics. I do, in some patients, use blood flow restriction training under supervision, right? So there are all these different, loaded stretching, which can be, it's passive, so it's loaded stretch. So you can generate hypertrophy that way, those experiments that they did with birds where unfortunately they weighed down one wing and that kind of stuff. So these are things that we hear about, we read about, but I hardly see it used in a patient population. And a lot of these patients post-surgery or with age, having, mobility issues, you do have to start to look at what you can do to optimize their muscle. And if we're talking about metabolic disease, then we cannot talk about metabolic disease and diabetes without looking at muscle and trying to increase quality and quantity of muscle.
Amen. And, one thing you taught me, you just mentioned, you and Ken Ford, was the blood flow restriction. I was not even aware of that as a particular intervention. I wonder how widely that is known within our group here. Have you heard of that as a approach? It's one that does have some evidence behind it.
I find that, first of all, it was known as Katsu training, originated in Japan. And what was startling was that they could do blood flow restriction and have the patient sedentary and still see improvements in muscle health. So this is a patient that's not actually even doing the resistance exercise. You're just having that blood flow restriction for about 20 minutes while they're sitting down. So that is quite fabulous. And this brings us to another silo, right? There's a lot of this information in exercise science, exercise physiology, for example, that we are not bringing into the clinical sphere. We're not translating that information.
So to a layperson like me, I'm thinking of this in the general classification of U stress, EU, good stress, not too much stress, but good enough, or good. And this is a lay question, I apologize. I sometimes do some jump roping and mild high intensity interval training with an altitude mask. I'm envisioning that I'm feeding my mitochondria, biogenesis, but I have no idea whether it's true or not.
Yes, that is a very low tech, Stan, you're right. Put the hand over it, Thomas, and that would be a low tech approach. But, I think that for someone who's not doing anything, almost anything will help. And you'll see this in sort of the weightlifting world, right? A new beginner who hasn't done anything, you can do anything. I just ask them to walk. I have my patients do chair raises. So just stand up from your chair. I have them do 100 squats a day. And there have been studies showing that you improve your body composition just with 100 squats a day or 100 chair stands a day. So just if you're starting from zero, almost anything will improve that quality of the muscle. And then as you get more and more trained, then you do have to be more nuanced in the approach.
Vivian, I'm sorry to continue this, inquest with you, but how is the blood flow restriction done? And I'm going to give you a particular context. A very, very good friend of mine was the assistant commissioner on aging for the city of New York. And for many years, she's had MS. And now for the first time, she is bedridden. It was a very, very long fight. And she says, I try to exercise every day. Now, what light can you shed on that for somebody who's that sedentary by force, not by choice, with regard to blood flow restriction and some of these easier exercises? Because for her, anything would make a difference.
So I have a patient who just broke her ankle, and we could see on the DEXA that she had just over several weeks. Basically, she lost a lot of muscle on the right side, which is where the injury was. And what I've had her do is just, she cannot weight bear. So just isometric contraction for now, right? And building up longer and longer periods. So that is something that you can do in any position, non-weight bearing, just contracting and getting that. In terms of blood flow restriction, that's something you do have to be careful about. You don't want arterial constriction. You just want to make sure that, you know, you delay the venous return, and that's a huge metabolic stress on the muscle. And it's actually a general metabolic stress because they found that you do see growth in other muscle groups, not just the muscle group that you have, you know, restricted in blood flow. So, and I think we need to do more work in that. They are using that in PT, in the medical field, in physical therapy, and especially in sports injuries, because, you know, these athletes cannot be out for a long period of time. But that's exactly it. We can use the science, we can use some of these strategies from the sports world, from the elite performance world. Why are we not using that? There's simple tools. So if you hurt yourself and you have been, you know, sort of, you're immobilized in some form, just even contracting the muscle, holding it for X number of seconds. You know, there are specific strategies for hypertrophy, specific strategies for strength. So you can address both. And I think there was a recent study that just came out that also showed that with isometric exercise, that you actually decrease your blood pressure. So that's something, again, we're not familiar with probably, and we're not passing on to patient populations. And we're always complaining that my patient can't do X, Y, Z, but they can pretty much, you know, contract their muscles wherever they are. If you're seated on a plane and you're stuck on a long flight, you could actually be doing some isometrics as well.
Well, great stuff, Vivian. We look forward to hearing from you tomorrow. And I'm going to now turn to our great friend, Ed Saltzman. Thank you, Ed, for your contributions earlier today. And what's your take? You've had a chance to digest some of this, and you always are incisive. As you said, and summing up the conference in London, tall order for you. But again, thanks. And what are your thoughts?
Well, you know what, I'm guilty of missing the bulk of this conversation. So are they, if you're asking me for thoughts on this conversation, I'm not.
No. Going back.
Postmortem for today, I attended most of today. I had to skip out on the diet panel or the nutrition panel, although the first part of it was incredibly interesting. I thought all of the panels today were, I really think, you know, you keep doing this meeting, it's going to get better and better. You know, there is a tendency, I think, sometimes to see some of the content as a little bit repetitive because you have some of the same people. But I suspect that everybody's thinking more. I mean, so just give you an example. We were moving from the evident and I think obvious for a while need for breaking down silos to actual conversations about how that could take place and how that could do place. And I thought that the FDA participants today were extraordinary. I thought they were incredibly, I can't say enough about them. All right. I mean, I've got, you know, I apologize if anybody from the FDA is on this call. I do know that there have been many times where, including one I spoke with you about, Zan, where, you know, we've had FDA participants and it's, you know, it's very by the book. It's very, very, you know, and it has a tendency to come across as not necessarily simpatico or supportive of innovation, you know, in this field. And I think that we broke that today. I thought they were all incredible. I really did. And just like even things like, you know, Teresa, I mean, her bringing up the analogy to osteoporosis. I never really thought of it, but I go back to the days of bone mineral density as being the marker. I remember a conversation like it was yesterday with Abbott, right, where they were the ones that were being chosen to develop the assay that was, I think, going to be the assay that was going to be used. And, you know, we've lived through all of that experience with those drugs and the marvelous benefits of the bisphosphonates, but also the, you know, the drawbacks. I thought she crystallized that incredibly well.
And can I be provocative there? I mean, she also came up with examples of biomarkers or initial thoughts that turned out not to be as insightful or as useful. And one of the questions I had was, are these sort of instances of being burned constraining them to be more asymmetrically conservative than not? But it might have been just have been my bias or my impression. Did anyone feel that, or was that just me?
I would only say, I feel like this is probably an unfair observation, and maybe it's grossly inaccurate, but I feel like the FDA's mission is not to innovate, okay? It might be to innovate in regulatory science, but it's not to innovate in therapeutics. It's to evaluate the companies that are claiming to innovate and, based on that data, and balance the effectiveness and the safety against the unmet need. So I mean, I don't think I would be surprised if I heard a very, I'm sure someplace at the FDA there's a lot of people working on exploratory biomarkers. It's not to suggest that, but I also quite strongly feel that it's going to be up to the innovators and and to the companies to do that. I thought Peter Libby made some extraordinary contributions today. I thought it was just I've seen him talk before. He's always impressive, but he was really on. I just think everybody was really thoughtful about this issue. So that was my take on it.
Excellent.
These issues, I should say, not this issue. There are a ton of issues, right? But I was just thinking, I made myself one note or a couple of notes throughout, and I looked back on it after the panel, and one was, outside of bisphosphonates, statins, is there a list of drugs that have been developed as very successful therapeutic interventions that are used predominantly in individuals that are not ill, okay, that we wouldn't consider to be disease, but simply at risk of a disease, because I always think of the statins as the poster child there, right?
It is.
Hypertension.
And hypertension, whether you think hypertension is a disease or a risk, but yes, again, the drugs for hypertension, so much of it in the coronary artery disease, space. I guess even, if you will, the use of the antiplatelet drugs to reduce the chance of stroke and AF. Now, AF is a clinical condition. I suppose it rises to a disease, not for me to determine, but I think that, the predominant medication that we use for AF is anticoagulation, to be on board in the event that there is a stroke, right? So, or to prevent the stroke. So we've got a bunch of those in our field, in cardiometabolic, and the final point I would make, I think it was really interesting, the Stephen Hahn, who I thought was great, by the way, tremendous. I think that when he talked about cancer, I think that it missed the point. The point when we were preparing for the panel, one of the things, Zan, I said to you during our conversation was that I don't know the amount of the cancer drug spend that's targeted at late stage disease, okay, advanced metastatic disease, but it's got to be the vast majority. It's got to be 95% of it. So cancer is not the way we want to think, okay? Because the cancer market and the regulatory innovation in cancer has greatly benefited, too many patients to count. But at the same token, there's been very little innovation in how we use the world of next generation sequencing to identify patients who are at risk and intervene, much earlier than we are right now. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that's beautifully said, Ed, and it really does contrast two different worlds: the world of people who are terribly ill and who fight for a few weeks of survival or even just a tissue response. And then the world of preventing their disease, where largely they're not going to experience any indication of benefit. Even for statins, nobody knows they have a high LDL cholesterol. At least they can see it when it goes down after going on statins. But it's going to be that much more difficult for starting out in a young population and trying to prevent the onset of chronic disease. So that's our big challenge.
Just to let everybody, everybody know that Ed is one of the 3 co-moderators of our day 3 afternoon session on commercialization, where we're going to look at the evolving models of commercialization amongst pharma and food and supplement companies, and then big data and other approaches. And the co-moderators include Joe Cook Jr., who used to be the CEO of Amylin and the chairman of Ironwood and a senior executive at Lilly, and Dennis Purcell, who was part of the financing of the biotech industry in the 80s and 90s. So plenty of really fascinating sessions to come as well. We have day 1, but day 2 and day 3 are going to be terrific.
And I don't know if this answers your question or adds to it. Beta blockers. You talked about some kinds of pills that were really not for an end disease. That was prescribed for me from age 10, not for a disease, but for tachycardia, which was not a disease. I've never had heart disease, and he had tachycardia. So beta blockers may be in that murky area that we could use perhaps in regard to different kinds of endpoints that have been acceptable by the FDA. This is just a layman's, experiential comment on this.
I remember it's probably 15 years ago. I'll never find the slide again, but I once took one of our, at that time, rising star analysts, and I said, let's take a list of validated surrogate markers, okay? Hypertension, LDL cholesterol being the bigger one, HbA1c being another one. We took a very short list, and I allocated pharmaceutical revenues to those markers, just to those markers, okay? And I said the value of a few validated surrogate markers, just a handful, okay? So if you can look at it put aside the public health and just look at it from a pure dark side point of view, in fact, I'm making money. Validating biomarkers is the way to spur innovation and be very successful, commercially. All right. I mean, it's what makes everybody comfortable. The problem that I didn't get to point out, during the panel today, but I'm hardly the first one to say this, and why beat the dead horse, but it is that if you sit as an advisor to a VC fund like I do, and you see the trail of diagnostic platforms coming in seeking financing, and it breaks down as soon as you run the numbers on the business model and the cost and length of time of validation. All right, and so until we can get to close that silo or that gap, between where the science is going, okay, in terms of prediction and prognosis, and where investors' heads are in terms of, can that be a business, okay? Outside of a few, really big sort of well-known examples like Grail and a few of the other ones that have really done well, there are thousands of companies, maybe thousands, but hundreds, legitimately hundreds out there struggling, okay? That can't raise a dime. I could talk with Dennis about this, but it's just, it's very, very difficult to innovate in diagnostics.
Well, that is definitely a challenge, as you know, that we're trying to address, that gap between science and commercial viability.
Yes.
It's the deal breaker for so many emerging companies.
Project endpoints.
Claude Lardmore, let me chime in on what Ed said about, bisphosphonates and I can't remember what the other one you said. Oh, the statins.
Yeah.
I think what, at least in my field of endocrinology, that is emerging is the tremendous benefit of GLP-1 agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors, and that has really changed the dynamics of the field of diabetes. But after saying that, it's really sad that only about 4 or 5% of patients that would clearly benefit from the therapy get the therapy.
Right.
And part of that is bureaucratic restrictions that don't allow it. So and then another biomarker, I actually think it's the very important biomarker that people debate about, and that's actually insulin resistance.
Yes.
I could care less if you say prediabetes, because what does prediabetes mean?
Yeah.
They say, well, your A1C is 6.3 and your glucose is 108. Well, I don't fast when I go get my labs done anymore because you don't need to. So I always am told I have prediabetes because my glucose is 109. And I've actually done a clamp on myself because I worked with Gerald Reaven back in the 80s. I'll never do it again,
Yeah.
but I was profoundly insulin sensitive.
Jerry
So-
Reven.
Yeah,
Yeah, he was a brilliant but tough old bird.
yeah. You know,
Just-
if Jerry had maybe 3 ounces of kindness in him sometimes, he would have got the Nobel.
He
would have got the Nobel Prize. He would have got the Nobel Prize for insulin resistance. I'm
Actually,
serious.
when
He should have got the Nobel Prize, but you know, he just wasn't politically correct, and you know how the committees decide who.
Well, he also well, I went to Stanford, and I was pretty junior, and he also wasn't all that kind to the younger generation. But just one quick comment, bringing this all full circle. Low carbohydrate, and specifically low glycemic index carbohydrate, increases GLP-1 and does not decrease GIP-1. And in our AJCN paper, you know, we have a nice, pretty model. Incretins are right in the middle there, right next to insulin and glucagon.
Yeah.
The incretins are there. So I'm not, you know, I think that, you know, we could just to keep in mind that these hormones, incretins and other hormones, you know, we're not there. Those pathways are not there so that the drug companies could exploit them. They're there to integrate diet with metabolism.
Right.
And we need to, I think, remember that diet is a drug too, and that many things that drugs can do, diet in a sophisticated approach can do with fewer side effects.
You know, I don't know if you listened early on, but I think I'm a real strong component that we should be doing Apoes, genotyping on all patients, because the nutritional recommendations are very different for a 2, 3, and a 4.
Yeah.
One other comment too, we always talk about this intermittent fasting, and it was always kind of confusing me. What does that really mean? But I think, you know, I think where the data is pretty convincing is in the time restricted feedings, where if you say to somebody, okay, you get 8 hours to do what you want to do, and the other 16 lay off.
Mm-hmm.
And when they've done that, those people in multiple different studies, they lose about 3% of their body weight.
Yeah.
And you're not telling them they can't eat something. What's happening is you're just saying, well, like for me, I can't have my 6-pack of beer before I go to bed now. I have to.
In the study by Athan Weiss, I think it was JAMA Internal Medicine, there was the signal of losing more lean than fat. And
Okay, that
so
might be.
I think that's where we have to think of interactions. If you're fat adapted, then you're not going to be secreting stress hormones to the same degree when you're fasting. If your fat cells are being inhibited by high insulin, then the only way to get calories out during a fast is with counter-regulatory hormones that are going to have adverse effects on body composition.
No, that's an excellent point, because I remember the drug that was supposed to help people lose weight, and it raised blood pressure about 8 millimeters of mercury. And I would always say,
Sibutramine.
I said, gee, how does this work? Weight loss is the best way to,
Right.
to lower your blood pressure, and your blood pressure goes up. And then, like I said, they showed that a lot of the mass that was lost was lean body mass, not fat mass.
Right.
It's all
No, I mean,
benefits.
one of the funny comments that because the insulin resistance discussion was making me think that, I guess it was Jerry Shulman who said today that listen, I've got see a lot of people with substantial insulin resistance who are not obese at all. They're very thin. So that's something I was thinking about, what David said before. And then the other thing that David said, I was thinking all day, which I was thinking, like, what's going on in this field? Big tent and everything, but what's going on in this field is that intervention, non-pharmacologic intervention in the form of lifestyle modification substantially works, okay? That is, if it's compliant and monitored and there's a motivated, patient on the other end of it. But because it does, which is wonderful news, this field's always going to have that also as a burden, right? Always as a burden, because we're never going to be, I don't think pharmaceutical intervention is ever going to quite be, I can't see a time when it becomes first line therapy, at least in the broader patient population, because of the demonstrated, positive, impacts of lifestyle modification, right? I mean, and we don't face that in the oncology field, okay? We don't face that.
If I may jump in, because we're talking about lifestyle modification, I also wanted to address something that Stuart Bachner, I think, put in the comments about how he tries to go low carb
Mhm.
and he's doing fine. And then if he eats, if he gets something sugary, then he's completely off. He goes off, and then his diet is over.
Right.
And this happens a lot in my patient population.
Mhm.
Now, we don't take into account the behavioral aspects. So one of the things that really irks me is this, when we counsel patients, we tell them to, eat things in moderation, once in a while, okay, every now and then. If you actually look at the data is very clear. If you counsel people to eat in moderation, they do not hit their goal, they cannot do it. Because there's no one, I just want to put it to you, there's no one that sits around saying, I'm going to stuff myself and make myself sick with all that eating. No, everybody thinks I'm going to do it in moderation. I'll just have a little bit, right? We know it's alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen, but we'll just have one, right? Now, and maybe a little one later, and then tomorrow. My point is we always go in thinking we're going to do it in moderation. The point is we haven't been able to do that. So our actual recommendations to patients should include this not very popular notion that, no, you know what, you can't do it in moderation, or you would have done it already.
Well, if it's all about calories, then you should be able to do moderation, right? There's no bad foods. You just, if you eat more of something, eat less of something else, or burn off those calories in exercise. But if food is affecting our risk through metabolic and hormonal effects, different situation. Then there's a model to understand why that one binge could really trigger a behavioral change that would be hard to reverse.
That's right. So if we're not, taking into account those aspects of behavior and not matching it to appropriate counseling, then we're just working against ourselves. And I see us doing that over and over again, which is very frustrating.
Well, we are going to have a session tomorrow on behavior. That is the big challenge. We all agree. One of the main drivers is not doing the right lifestyle choices, exercise and nutrition. And we've got to figure out ways of getting people to do that. There's a whole world that's being deployed against that kind of humane inertia, and that is digital technology and web-based coaching,
community building, cognitive behavior
approaching loneliness. There's just all kinds of stuff in that space, and again, it's another silo that we the other silos don't.
I know
touch.
we're getting close in time for a social hour, but another one of our speakers is Linda Freed, who's the dean of the Mailman School of Public Health in Columbia. She was just giving an address at NIH last week, I guess, and I was stunned by one piece of data, which is, by the way, not particularly new. I'm just I'm naive about these things, but she mentioned a study in which they took low-income folks and gave them volunteer opportunities, so gave them a purpose, and then they looked at the quantities, and they said that purpose-driven activity was worth equivalently to diet and exercise modifications. It's just stunning, the knowledge that we have out there that we're not kind of integrating and focusing to try to achieve real public health gains. So just wanted to.
Claude Lardmore again. Let me just make one sort of a little pet peeve I have, and it was brought up many times, and that's insulin resistance. There's this assumption that if I look at somebody and they're fat, they have to be insulin resistant, and if they're skinny, they aren't insulin resistant. And one of the first things I learned back in 1981 was we had patients that had BMIs of 40, and we almost ran out of glucose because they were so insulin sensitive. We couldn't pump enough glucose in them. Then we had people that were BMIs of 25, they were profoundly insulin resistant. And, when we look at Jerry's original work, he didn't include obesity in his work. It was high triglycerides, low HDL type of pattern. And so I'm actually chairing a conference this Saturday in Las Vegas on the diabetes pandemic. It's not, I used to say, is it time for a paradigm shift? No, it is time for a paradigm shift. But in that, I get annoyed when I keep hearing that obesity is the driver. It's insulin resistance. And I have to remind people, we have these little terms we call TOFI and FOFI. And tophi means thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And then fulfi is fat on the outside, fat on the inside. Well, if you look at those populations, there's more people that are thin on the outside, fat on the inside than fat on the outside, fat on the inside. So we're missing probably 50, 60% of people with IR because we assume they can't have it because they're not obese. And so I always get annoyed when they say obesity is the driver of COVID. No, it's not obesity, it's insulin resistance.
All right, well, Claude, we're going to give you the last word. And I do thank you and everybody else. We've had a great day. It's been fun downloading with all of you, and we'll do it again tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, we'll have a gala celebration with a live entertainer who I think you'll really enjoy.
Sounds good.
So we're going to say good night from Harper's Ferry, our little village, and
We'll see you tomorrow.
Yes,
Be there.
Please be
Yes.
there.